Laura Dawson had always prided herself on her independence. At 19, she was already shouldering responsibilities that most adults couldn't fathom. The sudden death of her father had left her mother and her to fend for themselves, with a mountain of bills, a house on the verge of foreclosure, and little hope of a brighter future. What she had never expected was that her world would come crashing down so soon, and that her life would be altered by the most unlikely of contracts. It was just past midnight when Laura sat at the small kitchen table, staring at a pile of unopened bills, her fingers trembling as she traced the edges of each letter. The past few weeks had been an emotional blur, the weight of reality sinking deeper with every missed payment notice. The bank had given them 1 week, before they took everything. Their house, the place where she'd spent every significant moment of her life, would be sold off to the highest bidder. It was only a matter of time now. Her mother, Margaret, was sitting across from her, absent-mindedly flipping through a magazine. Her face was pale, her eyes ringed with the exhaustion of sleepless nights. Laura had been doing all she could, working double shifts at the local diner, taking on any job she could find, but it was never enough. She'd been doing the math in her head for days now, even if she could scrape together every penny, it wouldn't make a dent in what they owed. "Mom," Laura said softly, her voice breaking the heavy silence, "we can't keep doing this. There's nothing left to sell." Margaret didn't respond immediately. Her hands were shaking as she folded the magazine, a wistful look crossing her face. "I know, sweetie. I know." Lara's breath hitched. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know how to make things better. The fear of losing everything was beginning to crush her spirit. Their home, their memories, it was all slipping through her fingers like sand. The silence in the room grew more suffocating, and then, Margaret did something Laura had never expected. She reached into her purse, pulled out an envelope, and placed it in front of her daughter. "Mom, what's this?" Laura asked, her fingers brushing the edge of the envelope. Margaret hesitated before answering, her voice quiet, almost embarrassed. "It's a proposal. A way out." Lara's brow furrowed. What kind of proposal? Her mother's eyes avoided hers, and she took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I've spoken to someone who can help us." "Who?" Lara's voice was sharp now, her pulse racing. Margaret didn't meet her eyes, but instead nodded toward the envelope. "His name is Damien Vero." Laura blinked, the name unfamiliar. "Damien Vero?" She repeated, her mind racing. Why would you be talking to him?" Her mother finally met her gaze, the guilt and desperation in her eyes undeniable. "He's a businessman. A very powerful man. He wants to make a deal." Lara's stomach twisted. "What kind of deal?" Laura blinked, the name unfamiliar. "Damien Vero?" She repeated, her mind racing. Why would you be talking to him?" Her mother finally met her gaze, the guilt and desperation in her eyes undeniable. "He's a businessman. A very powerful man. He wants to make a deal." Lara's stomach twisted. "What kind of deal?" Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, taking a breath. "He wants to marry you." Lara stared at her mother, utterly confused. "Marry me," she repeated slowly, as if trying to make sense of the words. "But, why me?" "Because he needs a wife, Laura," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. "His company needs him to be married for appearances, for legitimacy. And in exchange, he will save us. He'll pay off all our debts. We'll keep the house." Laura felt as though the room was spinning. The floor beneath her feet seemed to waver, the walls closing in as her mind tried to process what her mother was suggesting. Her marriage, her entire future, could be bought with money. I can't," Laura whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't right." Margaret's eyes were full of tears now. I know it's a lot to ask, but this is the only way." If we don't take this chance, we'll lose everything. Your father, he worked so hard to build this life for us. I can't let that slip away. Lara's hands clenched into fists on the table. You want me to marry some stranger, for money? Her mother's voice was soft, pleading. I know it's hard, but we don't have a choice, Lara. He'll give us everything we need. The house, the security. He can make all of this go away. Lara was silent for a long time. Her mind screamed at her to refuse, to walk away from the idea entirely, but then she thought about the house, the place where she and her mother had spent every waking moment, the place where her father's presence still lingered in the air. She thought about how much it would hurt to lose it all, to lose the last piece of her old life. The desperation was gnawing at her. Her voice broke through the quiet. What do I have to do? Her mother's eyes filled with sorrow, but she didn't look away. Just say yes. Sign the papers. And we'll be free of this. You'll be safe. We'll both be safe. Lara squeezed her eyes shut, feeling the weight of her choices pressing down on her chest. She didn't know how to feel. She didn't know how to process this new reality. All she knew was that her mother needed her. The house needed saving. And with one decision, everything could change. Taking a deep breath, Lara picked up the envelope and opened it, her fingers trembling as she read the details. The marriage was real. It would be binding. She would be legally tied to Damien Vero, a man she didn't even know. But as she read the terms, one word seemed to echo louder than the rest: survival. The next day, Lara found herself sitting across from Damien Vero in a high-rise office, the kind of place she'd only seen in movies. He was as cold and commanding as his reputation suggested, his dark eyes calculating, his presence imposing. Tall and broad-shouldered, he had the look of someone who was used to having his way, someone who was never questioned. And now, he was the man she was supposed to marry. Lara felt out of place in the sleek, polished room. The chairs were too plush, the walls too smooth. Everything about this man and this world felt foreign to her. But as she sat in front of him, trying to keep her composure, she realized just how small she really was in his world. Damien didn't smile. He barely acknowledged her existence beyond the contract laid out on the desk in front of them. His voice was low and smooth, the words rolling off his tongue with an authority that sent a chill through her. You know why we're here, he said, his eyes scanning the papers. You're signing a marriage contract, not a love affair. I'm not interested in anything other than what's necessary. We both have our roles. Lara swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. I understand. Damien's gaze flicked to her briefly, his eyes piercing as though searching for something in her that he hadn't found yet. Good. Once you sign, this is final. We move forward as agreed. She nodded slowly, but inside, her heart pounded in her chest. She wasn't ready for this. No one would ever be ready to marry a man they didn't know, a man who saw them as nothing more than a transaction. But in that moment, Lara knew there was no going back. Lara stood at the threshold of her new life, the heavy oak door to Damien Vero's mansion closing behind her with a soft, echoing thud. The coldness of the house seemed to seep into her bones, and for the first time in her life, she realized just how alone she truly was. Her mother had left the day before, a bittersweet goodbye filled with promises of a brighter future. Lara had held back her tears as her mother left, knowing full well that she was putting her trust, and her entire future, in the hands of a man she barely knew. A man who had made it clear that this marriage was not about love, but about appearances, about survival. As the door clicked shut, Lara turned to face the vast, empty space before her. The marble floors gleamed beneath her, the grand staircase sweeping upwards like something from a fairy tale, and yet, it all felt hollow. The house, though stunning, was eerily silent, too quiet for comfort. There was no warmth here, no laughter, no sense of belonging. Just a series of rooms that felt as cold as the man who had invited her to live in them. Welcome to your new home, Damien's voice broke through her thoughts. Lara jumped slightly, her hand instinctively clutching the strap of her purse. She hadn't expected him to be there. Damien stood at the top of the staircase, his expression unreadable, his dark eyes studying her from above. "Is there anything you need?" he asked, though his tone suggested he didn't particularly care. It was the same detached voice he had used when they first met, a voice that made it clear this was just business to him. To him, she was nothing more than a mere pawn in his carefully constructed life. His gaze lingered for a moment, and then he turned, heading up the stairs without another word. Lara exhaled slowly, her chest tightening as she walked further into the house. The weight of everything, the contract, the marriage, the looming uncertainty, pressed heavily on her shoulders. It was as if the very walls of this place were closing in on her, their silent judgment wrapping around her like a suffocating fog. The first few days were a blur. Damien rarely spoke to her, only providing brief instructions on where to be and when, mostly for public events. The rest of the time, she was left to wander the empty mansion in solitude. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional click of Damien's footsteps as he passed by, disappearing into his office or onto another call. Even when they were in the same room, there was an invisible wall between them, one that seemed impenetrable. It wasn't that Damien was cruel or overtly rude, but there was a sense of distance in everything he did. His gestures were polite, but formal, nothing more than the bare minimum required for their contract to remain intact. There was no affection, no tenderness, no attempt to bridge the gulf between them. The realization settled uneasily in Lara's chest. This wasn't a marriage, at least not in the way she had ever imagined. There was no connection between them, no spark, no hint of love. It was an arrangement, plain and simple. Still, despite her frustration and confusion, there were moments when Lara couldn't help but wonder about Damien, the man behind the contract. He was an enigma, an immovable force, one who existed in the shadows of his own life. There were fleeting moments when she saw a glimmer of something beyond the cold exterior, a brief hesitation in his eyes when they spoke, a quiet sigh when he thought she wasn't looking. But these moments were rare and quickly smothered by his calculated indifference. One evening, about a week into her new life, Lara found herself seated at the large dining table in the mansion's formal dining room. The room was vast, almost cavernous, with long windows that offered a sweeping view of the estate's perfectly manicured gardens. The table itself was set for two, but it felt wrong to sit there alone. Damien walked in, dressed in a sharp suit, his presence commanding the room even without words. His eyes flicked to the empty chair across from him before he sat down without a word. "Dinner's ready," Lara said softly, trying to break the silence that had stretched on for far too long. Damien looked up briefly, as though her words were the least of his concerns. He said nothing but picked up his fork and began eating. The clinking of silverware was the only sound between them. Lara's gaze flicked to him, then down to her plate. She had tried to make small talk before, but he had always shut her down with a simple, monosyllabic reply. There was something about the coldness in his eyes that made it feel like everything she said would be irrelevant. And yet, despite herself, she couldn't help but want to reach through the walls he had so carefully built around himself. "Why did you agree to this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why marry me? There are so many other women who would have jumped at the chance to marry someone like you." Damien's eyes flicked to hers for a split second, a glint of something unreadable crossing his face before he returned to his meal, as if the question hadn't even fazed him. "Because it was the easiest solution," he said flatly, his voice cold and unaffected. "You needed help. I needed a wife. It's a simple business arrangement." Lara felt her stomach twist at his bluntness. She had known he saw this marriage as a transaction, but hearing him say it so matter-of-factly made the reality hit harder than she expected. She forced a smile, even though it felt more like a grimace. "I guess I'm just a means to an end for you." Damien's gaze met hers again, this time lingering longer, as if considering her words. Then, without offering any apology or explanation, he returned his attention to his meal, and the moment was gone. Lara sat in silence, the weight of his words hanging in the air. There was no romance here, no illusion of love. This was survival. That. Words hanging in the air. There was no romance here, no illusion of love. This was survival. That was all it was ever going to be. As the days stretched on, Lara began to settle into a routine. She would wake early, unsure of what to do with her time, then wander the estate, exploring the endless hallways, trying to find some small piece of comfort. She spent hours in the library, reading to escape the oppressive silence that permeated every corner of the house. In the evenings, there would be another formal dinner, another round of carefully measured words and polite exchanges. Lara had begun to recognize that Damien's behavior wasn't just about keeping his distance, it was a way to keep control. He was a man who thrived on power, on control, and on maintaining an emotional distance. He had never asked for this marriage, just as she hadn't. But they were bound to it, each holding up their end of the bargain. One night, after dinner, Lara found herself staring out the large windows at the garden below, lost in thought. She had thought the house would offer her a kind of refuge, but now it felt like a gilded cage. She wasn't sure which was worse, the loneliness of her new life or the growing realization that she had no idea who the man she was married to really was. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. Damien stood beside her, just close enough that she could feel his presence without actually being touched. His eyes were distant, his face unreadable as always, but for the first time, Lara sensed something different, a flicker of hesitation, an uncertainty that she couldn't quite place. "I didn't expect you to last this long," he said, his voice low, almost grudging. Lara turned to him, surprised by the unexpected comment. "I didn't expect it either," she replied, her voice softer than she intended. "But here I am." Damien's eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, she saw something almost human, before he quickly looked away. And for the first time since their marriage began, Lara wondered if there was more to him than the cold businessman he portrayed. Maybe, just maybe, they weren't so different after all. The silence between Lara and Damien had grown almost comfortable, though it was the kind of comfort that existed in an unspoken agreement, one where neither of them acknowledged the awkward tension that clung to the air like dust. For the first time in her life, Lara found herself in a luxurious prison, with nothing to do but fill the hours in a mansion that didn't feel like home. She had little company, aside from Damien's rare, curt instructions and the occasional brief, disinterested conversations they had during dinners. There were no invitations for deep talks or shared laughter, just the daily reality of a marriage held together by a contract. Despite the emptiness of the house, despite the lack of warmth in her marriage, Lara clung to the fragments of a quiet hope. She had always believed in people's potential for kindness, and she wondered if she could find that in Damien. He was distant, yes, but she couldn't ignore the small things. The moments where his eyes would flicker with something that resembled emotion, the way he would briefly let his guard down when he thought she wasn't watching. One evening, as the sky darkened and the wind outside howled faintly against the windows, Lara found herself wandering through the house, unable to sleep. The hallways were bathed in moonlight, casting long shadows against the pristine floors. She had already explored every corner of the estate, from the grand library to the beautifully manicured gardens, but it still felt like she was drifting through someone else's life, someone who didn't belong. Her footsteps echoed through the hall as she reached Damien's office door. He had been working late recently, poring over financial reports and contracts, his work never seeming to end. She hesitated for a moment before knocking softly. "Come in," his voice called from inside, flat and emotionless. Lara opened the door and stepped into the dimly lit room. Damien sat behind a large, dark wood desk, the glow of his computer screen illuminating his sharp features. His jacket was discarded over the back of his chair, and his sleeves were rolled up, showing the muscles in his forearms. The sight of him, so concentrated and isolated in his world, stirred something within her, a small spark of curiosity, of wanting to understand him better. "You're still up," Lara said, her voice tentative, trying to mask the loneliness that she felt. Damien didn't look up immediately. Instead, he ran a hand through his dark hair, the faintest sign of weariness crossing his face before he fixed his gaze on her. "I'm not sure what time it is anymore," he replied with a sigh. "What brings you here?" Lara shrugged lightly, unsure of what she was hoping for. "I was just wandering. Couldn't sleep." A brief silence passed between them, thick and uncomfortable. She wasn't sure if she was supposed to leave, but Damien's gaze softened slightly before he leaned back in his chair. "You should rest. The mansion is large. Too large for one person to feel at ease in," he said, a touch of empathy leaking into his tone. For a moment, Lara stood there, unsure of what to say. She had no idea what it was about him that made her want to reach through the walls he had carefully constructed. Perhaps it was that little sliver of vulnerability she could see, something fleeting, but undeniably real. "I can't help but feel like I don't belong here," she said quietly, her voice almost lost in the vastness of the room. Damien's eyes flicked to her, his expression unreadable. Then, to her surprise, he pushed his chair back slightly, standing up to face her. For the first time, his posture was less commanding, less distant. "You're not the only one," he said, the words carrying a weight she hadn't expected. "I didn't want this arrangement. But sometimes, you have to make sacrifices." Lara blinked, caught off guard. He had never admitted that before, never shown any hint of discomfort with their situation. But there it was, laid bare in that small moment. "You don't have to explain yourself to me," she said, though her voice faltered slightly. "I didn't choose this either." There was a long, uncomfortable pause, before Damien finally broke the silence with a sigh. He walked over to a bookshelf on the far wall, running his fingers along the spine of a few books, as if lost in thought. Then he turned back toward her, his eyes softening just enough to let her see a glimpse of the man behind the cold facade. "You're right. None of us did," he said quietly. "But I never imagined it would be this way. This, empty." Lara didn't know how to respond. She had only ever known loneliness in a different form. The kind that came from scraping by, from watching her mother's hope dim with every passing day. But this was something else entirely. A wealth that didn't come with love. A house that was full of everything but warmth. "I'm sorry," she whispered, suddenly feeling a wave of compassion for him. She could see now how much of his life was built on duty, on expectation. Maybe that's all he had known too. Damien paused, his hand still resting on the book's cover, his gaze turned inward. "I don't need your sympathy, Lara," he said, though his voice lacked its usual edge. "I'm not the one who needs saving." Lara bit her lip, unsure of how to proceed. There was a kind of sadness in him that she hadn't fully understood until now, an emotional cage that mirrored her own. And suddenly, the walls she'd built around herself, the walls of resentment in her, began to feel a little less sturdy. "Maybe no one needs saving," she said, her voice quieter now, more thoughtful. "Maybe we're just trying to survive." Damien's eyes flicked to hers, a flicker of something, reluctance, vulnerability, maybe even relief, passing across his features. For a brief moment, they stood there, caught in the silence, a strange understanding passing between them. "You're right," he said, his voice quieter now. "Just to survive." Days turned into weeks, and although things didn't change drastically, something subtle began to shift between them. Lara couldn't pinpoint when it happened, but slowly, Damien's coldness began to thaw, just a little. He still didn't offer her affection or warmth in the way she might have hoped, but he started to engage with her in small ways, nothing major, just moments that spoke volumes. There were times when he'd bring her a coffee in the morning without saying a word, as if he'd just thought of her needs for the first time. Other times, he would ask her opinion on a decision regarding the company, or take a moment to explain something about his work without the usual disinterest. It was nothing grand, nothing life-changing, but to Lara, these moments meant something. They meant that, in some small way, he was beginning to see her, not just as his contractual wife, but as a person. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was the beginning of something. One evening, Damien invited her to join him for dinner outside on the terrace. The air was cool, and the sky was clear, the stars twinkling in the vast expanse above them. For the first time since their marriage began, the atmosphere felt less suffocating. They sat across from each other, the table set with a simple meal, the soft light of the lanterns flickering gently between them. Lara took a deep breath, her gaze shifting toward the distant lights of the city. She wasn't sure why she felt the urge to speak, but something about the quiet night made it feel like a safe place for her thoughts to escape. "You know," she began softly, "I thought this would be harder. I thought we'd always be strangers to each other." Damien looked at her across the table, his expression contemplative, though his voice remained neutral. "Maybe we still are." Lara smiled faintly, though there was a touch of sadness in her eyes. "Maybe. But it's easier than I expected. Maybe because I understand you a little more now." He didn't respond immediately, his gaze lingering on her for a long while. Then, he took a slow breath, his shoulders relaxing just a fraction. "Maybe I understand you a little more too," he said quietly. And for the first time, it felt like they were beginning to break free of the walls between them. The days since their quiet dinner on the terrace had passed with an unusual ease. Lara had begun to sense that something had shifted between her and Damien, subtle, fleeting moments of connection that hinted at a future beyond their contractual marriage. They weren't there yet, of course, but the ice that had once encased their interactions was beginning to crack. Still, the coldness in Damien remained, a persistent shadow that lingered in his eyes, in his actions. He never fully let his guard down, even as he began to open up just a little. But the walls were slowly lowering, and Lara was beginning to see him for more than the distant businessman she had married out of necessity. It was an ordinary Tuesday when the shift came, a phone call that would shake the foundations of everything she thought she knew about her husband. Lara sat on the couch in the library, her fingers tracing the spines of books she had read countless times, seeking something to fill the silence. Damien's work schedule had kept him in meetings all day, and she was once again left to her own devices. It had become routine, the quiet moments alone, but today, a strange restlessness gnawed at her. She was just about to pick up a book when her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Damien's voice from the hallway. He was speaking to someone in a low tone, his words clipped and urgent. She couldn't make out the full conversation, but the tension in his voice was unmistakable. "What's going on?" she whispered to herself, curiosity and concern prickling at the back of her mind. Lara hesitated for only a moment before slipping from the couch and toward the hallway, moving as quietly as she could. She peeked around the corner and saw Damien standing near the large window at the end of the hall, his back to her as he held the phone to his ear. His posture was rigid, tense, his jaw clenched in frustration. "I told you to stay away from her," he growled into the phone, his voice low but sharp, like a blade cutting through the air. Lara froze, her heart racing. His tone had changed, hardened. He was no longer the man she had begun to understand, the man who had shown her kindness and vulnerability. This was someone else entirely, the cold, ruthless Damien Vero she had first met. "I don't care what you have to do. Keep it contained. If she's involved in this mess, I'll deal with it myself," he continued, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. Lara felt a chill creep up her spine. She knew this was not about business. The venom in his words, the sense of danger hanging in the air, was something far more personal. Something dangerous. He turned away from the window, walking toward the door to the study. The conversation seemed to have ended abruptly, but the anger in his eyes was palpable. Lara retreated, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't know what she had just overheard, but she knew one thing for sure, Damien was hiding something. Something big. The next few days were clouded by unease. Lara could feel the shift in the atmosphere, even if Damien did his best to keep up appearances. His behavior had become even more distant, even colder, and she found herself wondering what had happened during that phone call. What was so important, so dangerous, that it made him act the way he did? She wanted to confront him, to demand answers, but something held her back. She wasn't sure if it was fear or the sudden realization that perhaps she wasn't ready for the truth. But the questions lingered, swirling in her mind, growing more insistent with each passing hour. It wasn't until a week later that she got her answer. It was late in the evening when Lara found herself in the garden, taking a walk to clear her head. The air was cool, and the stars were bright above, but the stillness of the night did little to calm her racing thoughts. She had been thinking about Damien, about the phone call, about the secrets he seemed so desperate to keep. She was just about to turn back toward the house when she heard footsteps behind her. She tensed, but when she turned, it was only Damien. He looked different tonight, his face drawn, his shoulders stiff. He wasn't wearing his usual suit, but instead, a simple black shirt and jeans, which somehow made him appear more vulnerable, more human. "I didn't expect to see you out here," Lara said, her voice soft. Damien didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the path ahead of them. He walked slowly toward her, his expression unreadable, but there was a heaviness in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. It was as if the weight of something he had been carrying was finally becoming too much. "I've been avoiding you," he said quietly, his voice low. "I've been avoiding everything." Lara raised an eyebrow, unsure of where this conversation was going. "Why?" He stopped a few feet away from her, his hands buried in his pockets. He seemed to be gathering his thoughts, as if weighing the decision to tell her something he had kept hidden for a long time. "You overheard me," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "The phone call. You want to know what it was about?" Lara's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to acknowledge it, let alone bring it up. She nodded, unable to find her voice at first. "I'm not proud of it," he continued, his eyes briefly meeting hers. "I made mistakes. And now, my mistakes are catching up to me." Lara's curiosity began to outweigh her caution. "What mistakes, Damien? What is this? What are you involved in?" For the first time, there was a flicker of something in his eyes, guilt, perhaps, or fear. His mouth tightened into a line, and he seemed to wrestle with something deep inside before finally speaking. "My family, we have ties to things you wouldn't understand," he began, his voice low, almost ashamed. "My business, my success, it's not as clean as it seems. I've been involved with people, dangerous people. The mafia.